Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is Saturday, November 23rd, 2024, and you are watching or listening The Rundown, Episode 9, my weekly podcast where I talk about all things video games and sometimes anime-related nonsense. I am your host, as always, Corrupt Ronin. For today's episode, we're going to get right into some, there's a lot of controversy and nonsense going on these days when it comes to video games as well, but it gets worse because some of this stuff is also tied to the anime and manga industry as well, and how that may be interlinked with some things going on into the future in regards to Sony, but we'll get into that a bit later. But first up, we'll talk about the Game Awards and the nominees and why some of these nominees are perhaps surprises, and some may argue probably shouldn't even be on the list, but we'll talk about what those are and why that may be the case later on. Vancy says she's nervous. Oh, don't worry. It's gonna be great, Vancy. It's gonna be fine. Everything's gonna be fine. Don't worry. I cannot promise you that. I say that with fingers crossed, but we'll get into that a bit later for sure. First up, like we said, we're gonna talk about the Game Awards nominees and the controversy surrounding that. Then we're gonna talk about what's going on with Kadokawa and the potential of Sony to effectively buy out the company, and why there may be some deeper problems going on that no one is actually talking about, that we'll get into later as well. Plus, it's also maybe linked to further issues going on with Sony and how this may affect their PlayStation brand in the future, and how they want to change, potentially or possibly change, the perception of their brand going forward. And I'll get into the history of that and why I think that may be the case. As always, if you guys enjoy the show, don't forget to obviously like it and subscribe on YouTube as well, as these go up on YouTube. I haven't been recording them live on YouTube lately just to avoid my internet being kind of spotty with the weather changing, and I can't guarantee that I can dual stream this stuff on YouTube at the same time. So I'm recording these live on Twitch for now, and then the archives will go up on YouTube afterwards. So for those that want to catch these things live, until that changes, you can head over to my Twitch channel, which I'm not quite sure how long I'm going to be on Twitch to begin with, considering the controversy that's been going on there as of late. And honestly, I'm not quite sure if Twitch is going to be around for too much longer either. But I've talked about that. And, I meant to talk about that in last week's episode, but I just didn't have the time to do so, unfortunately, because I had so much news to talk about. But I have talked about this on streams, about what's going on with Twitch, so. And if you've been following any of that news as well, you kind of start getting the picture that Twitch might not be around for too much longer at the rate they're going. Let's put it that way. But without further ado, let's get into the episode and talk about these here video games. So first up, as I cycle through my notes, which I'm trying to get used to writing my notes down on paper, which is what I'm doing now. So I have a whole notebook here full of notes for the podcast that I wrote down. But anyways, let's get into the Game Awards crap that we're going to talk about real quick. And we're going to run down some of the categories and the nominees for them. But the big one is obviously the Game of the Year category, because of course it is, and the nominees that are in that section. So let's take a look at that real quick. As you can see, well, first of all, I guess I'll just say it straight up. I was very mistaken about the Black Myth Wukong nomination. I had been, for the longest time, saying that I cannot see this game ever getting nominated, considering what was going on with the controversy surrounding the game leading up to its release, and the way Access Media has been talking about it before the game came out, and after the game came out, and perhaps even after its nomination, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And as you can see here, we have Astrobot, Balatro, which is the card game, and that's also stirred up quite a bit of controversy in the gaming community. Black Myth Wukong, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. Not Elden Ring the base game, it's DLC, which has also stirred up some controversy. And then we have Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Metaphor ReFantazio, which I guess there's maybe 3 games on this list that I haven't had a chance to play, but everything else I did. I haven't played Astrobot yet. I do intend to. I haven't played Balatro because I'm not a fan of card games. And Metaphor I want to get to, but if anybody's played an Atlas game, those you already know. Those are time sinks. You'll be playing that game for the next year before you actually finish it. And there's a lot of games that come out that I would like to get to for my personal Game of the Year categories as well. And sitting down and playing Metaphor for the next year will leave me assed out, so to speak, when it comes to playing other games. So that one I had to put to the side while I play everything else this year, unfortunately. So yeah, The controversial ones so far would be Balatro and Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. And Elden Ring is probably the most controversial one because it is a DLC. And before these nominees came out for the Game Awards, there was some news that broke saying that they were changing the rules about the requirements that the jury uses to nominate these games. And when that happened, everybody kind of had the suspicion that Elden Ring was going to end up on this list because, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, Elden Ring was the only game that had a substantial piece of content like this come out over the course of the year. And it was the most talked about piece of content that came out this year. So it was obvious that they did this. Well, I shouldn't say it's obvious because I don't have any proof that that's the case, but people kind of had suspicions that they were doing this for the sake of Elden Ring. And lo and behold, when the nominees come out, that's exactly what we see as Elden Ring on this list. And I guess the question is whether or not it deserves to be on the list. Some would argue that it does because it is a substantial piece of content and enough of a new experience to warrant it being almost a separate game on its own, which personally I do agree with. As somebody who loved the base game of Elden Ring, one of my complaints about the base game was that it kind of felt like it was padded out unnecessarily so. To the point where it was kind of a detriment of the game, and I felt that if they had cut out maybe, let's say 20% of the content that's in this game and focused it more on the actual boss fights and kind of condensed it down just a little bit more than what it was, I probably would have enjoyed that game more. Not that I hated Elden Ring. Obviously, it was one of my favorite games of 2022. But I think if they had made that change and maybe cut out 20% of the content that was unnecessarily there, for example, the repeat boss fights. If you explore the world of Elden Ring and really dig through it, you will find repeats of bosses you've already fought. And you would think, okay, well, if they're bringing this boss back, then maybe they've added different moves and different attacks that it has to make it feel fresh. And in many cases, they don't. It's just the same damn boss. And From Software is kind of notorious for doing that in its games. But you would think for a big game like Elden Ring, they would start trying to move away from that to kind of set a new standard for themselves. But no, they didn't do that. In Shadow of the Erdtree's case, the reason why I preferred that more is because it was a more condensed experience. Although it is shorter than the base game, obviously, it felt a lot more, like a lot of the environments and the encounters felt fresh because it was much more condensed. And I think if they had gone that route with the base game, then Elden Ring for sure would have been my favorite game of 2022. That being said, you cannot access this content without owning the base game of Elden Ring. If they had made this a standalone thing, which they totally could have done, then I could see it being nominated for Game of the Year. But it's not. You have to own the base game of Elden Ring. Not only that, but you also have to play through a significant portion of the base game to get to the content. Now, I know all about the speed runs and the exploits and the hacks and all that stuff to get there if you want to get there faster. But for the average player playing the game, if they want to get to Shadow of the Erdtree, they have to play through a significant portion of the content to get there. On top of the fact that it is optional content that you don't have to do. So while it is, one of my favorite pieces of DLC that came out this year, I personally don't think it deserves to be on this list. And the fact that they made this change specifically for Elden Ring just kind of speaks to the level of collusion that goes on behind the scenes at the Game Awards. And we all knew this from the beginning, but it's just the audacity to make it this obvious. And that's kind of what this is. So, kind of understand people being upset about that because I get it. Like, even the people that love Shadow of the Erdtree, we all agree that it really does not need to be on this list. Not the way it's been sold, not for what it is, and the fact that you have to own the base game and play through a significant portion of the base game to get to it. It doesn't make a lot of sense at all. Now, obviously you see I haven't voted on any of this stuff yet because I haven't signed in, and I'm probably not going to vote on any of this crap to begin with because at the end of the day, for those who don't know, when it comes to the Game Awards, our votes, the players' votes, only counts as 10% of the overall votes for these games, while the remaining 90% comes from a very specific jury they have behind the scenes that vote on these categories. And unfortunately, and perhaps maliciously so, there used to be a jury category on the website, but as you can see, For this year, there is no jury category. It's a question of, well, why did they change that? Why is there no jury category? Well, because people started calling them out. Because they realized that a lot of the people that are on the jury are also people from various publications and access media websites that kind of shit on and attacked games like Black Myth Wukong. On top of the fact that they made this change, and if people, you saw how people reacted to the change that they made for Game of the Year. So they knew that once this happened, people would immediately start going after the jury to explain yourself. Why is this happening? And people say it's Jeff's fault for the reason why this happened, but from what I can tell, Jeff has a history of trying to be as hands-off with the Game of the Year categories as possible, mostly because he tends to focus on dragging up Hollywood actors and shit on stage and advertisements just to pad out time for the Game Awards and get as much money as he possibly can out of it. I'm sure that's where most of his efforts are going outside of the games that are being nominated for this stuff this year. So I highly doubt this was a decision on his part specifically. But either way it goes, it's not a good look. We look in the other categories here, because as you may have noticed, especially in the Game of the Year category, there is one specific game that somehow got a lot of high scores overall, particularly on Metacritic, but it's also missing here. Give you maybe 5 seconds to guess. Nothing? I'll tell you. Dragon Age The Veilguard is missing from this list. And to be fair, there were a lot of publications out there that were not too happy about the omission of this whole thing. So much so that instead of asking questions about why it's missing, most of them kind of got upset about the fact that, and I'm going to show an image here real quick. Hold on. Let me add it. Let me see if I got it first of all. Pretty sure I got it. Took a screenshot of it. Let me put it on screen for you guys here in just a moment. Is this it? Yeah, this is it. They took it upon themselves to single out one specific game on this list, a game that I told you was going to get called out if it ever made it on this list, which I doubted it would because of the people behind it. But now that it's here are the reactions to it. And I believe this collage comes from a content creator by the name of Kyle on YouTube and Twitter. I'll show this in just a moment. And he's got a history of doing like these crazy collages of stuff that comes out from Access Media in general, and video games, and that stuff is like incredibly pertinent to information you might need when you're doing shows like podcasts and making videos. So as you can see on the screen, you can see which game got the most shit for being nominated for Game of the Year. And this is just a list of all these publications that got very upset about that game being nominated. Everything from let's see, Game Rant to Polygon to Games Reactor UK, Kotaku. Some even have multiple articles talking about it. Vice. Like, all these people are just upset about the fact that Wukong got nominated. Not Kyle like Superman. It's a different kind of Kyle, spelled with a C. I think Cyael is what the name is. And he does a lot of hilarious videos on YouTube talking about this stuff. He also makes these collages as well that are very useful when it comes to like collating information about what's been going on as of late. And if you think it's bad now, when you see some of these collages, it's kind of ridiculous. It says, but everyone I know says it was a great game. According to public access media, they try to make it seem like, oh, it's just the gamers that are getting upset about Black Myth Wukong, and it's those evil right-wingers that are out there. It's those evil right-wingers that are out there trying to vie for this game and coming after the access media for it. It's like, I didn't know that, calling out access media for shitting on a game before anyone's ever played it, with very little information and incorrect translations on Chinese social media, somehow makes you right-wing? I didn't know that was possible. I guess apparently I'm right-wing now for calling this shit out with everybody else. I didn't know that's how that worked. Who knew? Anyways, I don't really put too much stock in Game of the Year or the Game of the Award stuff or the Game Award stuff because I already know a lot of this shit is rigged, and even more so now when you consider that our votes when it comes to it doesn't really matter all that much. Now the question is, who could I see winning out of the Game of the Year category? And honestly, for a while there, I kept saying that Black Myth Wukong has no chance. I was like, it got nominated, but I feel like its nomination was more of a formality than anyone actually wanting it to be here. But then I started thinking about it, and I'm like, I could be wrong. There could be a very high chance that Wukong ends up taking it. But the only conditions by which it would win is if the jury has an almost even split down the middle on who's deciding whether or not this game wins. And the only way that would take this game over the edge to winning the category is if that even split happens and the gamers themselves like unanimously vote specifically for one game to win, and that would be Wukong. And that would be the only way it would take it. And when you consider, now that also depends on whether or not this competition is open to Chinese gamers as well. Because if China's aware of this, in which they probably are, considering that this game is nominated now, and if the Chinese audience comes in and starts voting for Wukong, then the chances of it winning increase significantly in that regard. Considering the amount of the Chinese audience that actually bought this game. Like when I say the Chinese audience bought this game, in numbers, I'm talking about in numbers that basically eclipses practically every other market in the world. Which is part of why that game is sold so well. So I thought to myself for a while, I'm like, nah, Wukong probably isn't going to make it. The only reason why it's here is more of a formality to keep people from going off on them. How's it going, Raikou, by the way? But I could be wrong about that. There could be a very high chance that Wukong wins, but it would have to be under very specific conditions with the jury to make this happen. If not that, then the other game that I could see possibly winning would probably be Shadow of the Erdtree. Because, I mean, they moved heaven and earth to get this game on the list. So I could see it winning. And if not for Shadow of the Erdtree, then it would have to be Metaphor. Astrobot would be a good contender as well, but it's a platformer. And while the people that have played the game sure like it, not everybody likes platformers, unfortunately, because quote unquote, it's too kiddie. It's not adult. It's not realistic. Which honestly is part of the reason why games kind of suck today, is because of that mindset, but I digress. Now, I talked about the missing part of Dragon Age, the Veilguard not being added to the list. And if you look at many of the categories, we're talking best game direction, nothing. It's the same. It's the same 6 games. Best narrative, nothing in sight. I don't even know how Hellblade got here, but again, that's one of those cases of this thing being rigged to the point of not being surprised to see stuff like this. Best art direction, not surprising. But as you can see, nothing in here has Dragon Age at all. Games for Impact. This one I feel like is kind of a paid category because no one knows what these games are. And not only the fact that nobody knows what these games are, these games did not sell well. So I cannot see who's out here putting these games in any category outside of someone behind the scenes that is just trying to, pay off the idea of having these games win an award. But one of the arguments that people had for the reason why Dragon Age is not included is because, it came out too late. That's the reason why it didn't get nominated for anything. And to that, I would say, hold on. Where's it at? To that, I would say, if that was the case, then how do you explain this? Oh, that's right. Dragon Age is right here in innovation and accessibility. Which means that it wasn't too early. Because it obviously made it into a category in the list. My speculation on this, and again, this is just speculation, conjecture, take everything you hear here with a grain of salt, is that the reason why this game didn't quite make it into nearly every category on the list, regardless of its high reviews, is that right after the game came out, it was like there was a weird, sudden shift in perception around the game. Everything went from praising the game for being BioWare's quote-unquote return to form to people calling it out saying that this was BioWare's worst. And that the game's political messaging was extremely heavy-handed and detrimental to the groups that it was trying to cater to. And that's coming from the groups that it was trying to cater to. On top of that, the perception really started flipping right after the election. Now, again, I am not a political podcast. I'm not a political content creator. Like I said, I don't care which side of the aisle you fall on. I don't care who you voted for. Actually, no, I'll take that back. I care who you voted for, but I don't care enough to the extent that I'm going to make a big deal out of who you voted for, because I don't think it's all that important. So I said, Drummond and no flying mechs. Yeah. So the whole perception like flipped around this game. And honestly, there's been a weird shift overall, like completely across the board, like when it comes to entertainment as a whole since the election, which is interesting to say the least. But again, I don't care who you voted for. And I say that just to be nice. I do care. I do care, but I'm not going to make that big of a deal of it because that's not part of what this show is. But yeah, so there you go. Dragon Age has obviously been nominated, so it wasn't too late for it to get nominated. On top of the fact that when it comes to like reviewers and access media, there are times where these publications, and as somebody who's been on that side of the aisle of getting games in advance for reviews, sometimes you will get games in advance to review upwards of 1 week to an entire month before its release date. And that depends on, what state the game is by the time it's ready to go gold, or whatever, what state the game is in by the time it's ready to launch. So I've been on that side of the aisle. I've seen some of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And as someone who has had a game for review upwards of 2 weeks before its release, trust me, they've had plenty of time to decide whether or not this game was going to make it for Game of the Year. Especially if it's good. I recall, wasn't it, I think it was Death Stranding that had like almost a 3-week advance review before the game came out. And that was like on the more extreme side of things because they were just that confident in the game being good, where they put that game out really early in developers' hands before it actually came out. Or not developer, but publications' hands before it actually came out. I recall something like that being the case for Death Stranding. But yeah, so overall, again, like I'll be watching this show like I always do with you guys. I'll be live broadcasting it. And, I'm sure Wolf will be there. And if anybody else wants to join for the live commentary, you're more than welcome to do so. But yeah, I'll be watching this not because I honestly give a shit about this show, because truth be told, I really don't care that much about this show. And as I see stuff like this happening, it gives me even more reason to not care about what's going on. But the fun I have with you guys watching is probably what makes it worth it at the end of it. My suspicions about Black Myth Wukong winning increased when I kept seeing the game pop up in other award shows from Access Media, like the Golden Joystick Awards, and that the game Black Myth Wukong won Ultimate Game of the Year at the Golden Joystick Awards this year. Something that I never would have seen coming. But seeing that has kind of changed my doubts about Black Myth Wukong winning. I don't know how the voting works at the Golden Joystick Awards, whether or not this player focused or not. But who knows? My perception has definitely changed on whether or not this game will win. Which, honestly, I don't care who wins Game of the Year, truth be told. And this is the case of me saying I really don't care. I do think it's still not a good look for Elden Ring to be on here at all. And even worse is that, like, people will make the argument that the Game Awards categories have always been kind of loose, where they kind of played it fast and loose with their categories, which is true to an extent. When you take, for example, what is it, the Best Ongoing Game section? Where is that? Best Ongoing. Best Ongoing, like last year's Best Ongoing was given to Cyberpunk for its Phantom Liberty expansion. Now, Cyberpunk came out in 2020, okay? And obviously that game was a broken mess, of course. And Phantom Liberty came out at the tail end of 2023, which was an amazing piece of DLC. And the updates that they did behind the game kind of revitalized what that game was and fixed a lot of those issues. It didn't quite restore player trust in CD Projekt Red, considering what happened with the drama behind that game in the beginning. But it did help in saying, like, we're going to make good on this by fixing these issues and then putting out substantial content that makes sense. So it did win this category last year, although some people would say that this category is more dedicated to live service games more than anything else, which does make sense. But when you take into consideration that nearly every game that comes out now usually launches in a broken state and then has to be constantly patched to get fixed, on top of the fact that they're constantly adding new stuff to it over time, On top of the fact that also a lot of these games, even the single player ones, have microtransactions behind them as well. In which case, you could almost say that nearly every game is a live service game at this point. But even then, with these categories, I don't really mind them playing it all that fast and loose with these categories and not having too much of a hard or rigid standard with that. Where I do think it really matters is for Game of the Year. This should be the category where you take a hard stance on because it is supposed to be the best game of the year. If all the other categories you're much more flexible about when it comes to your standards, Game of the Year should be much more rigid than that. Because if you're not doing it for the best game of the year, then what's the fucking point of this award show? Some would argue that there is no point, which, to be fair, that's a fair argument. But if you have no standards for any of your categories, then what's the fucking point? What's the point? Especially Game of the Year. But anyways, that's the Game of the Year nonsense. And you understand why. Why Dragon Age is not on here. And probably for good reason, as somebody who's also played, I don't want to say a large portion of it, but played enough of the game to realize that I did not like it and ultimately ended up dropping it. My overall thoughts on the Veilguard is that, yeah, that game is... Whoever said that was a BioWare's return to form is a goddamn liar. It is absolutely not BioWare's return to form. It is the exact opposite. It is everything that people hate about modern BioWare amalgamated into one game. I tried many times to give that game a chance, and I don't drop games very easily. It takes a lot. Even bad games, I will find myself dragging myself through them just to say I played them. But the Veilguard, I just could not do it. And if you don't believe me that I played it, there's plenty of evidence on my YouTube channel in the live section of me playing the game. I have tried. It ain't happening. Like I said, did you play Andromeda? I did play Andromeda, and somehow I managed to play all the way through that game. And yeah, that... You want to talk about BioWare's falling off. That's definitely the high point of that as well. I don't know how I finished Andromeda, but I did. I dragged myself through that one as well. Sadly. Since you dropped it midway, understandable. The game is not memorable at all. And even worse is the fact that these are the same people that are working on the next Mass Effect. My faith in that regard has dropped off a fucking cliff. So if you're gonna drag yourselves down this whole BioWare, then go all the way. Ruin Mass Effect 2 and see how that goes for you. Let's see. Thomas says, "Do you think Death Stranding 2 will win? Win what?" So both big BioWare franchises and a new IP didn't pan out well. Yeah. So like honestly, I thought when Dragon Age came out, like, I figured the game would probably sell well enough to keep BioWare afloat, but I would not have been surprised if it didn't. And honestly, if Dragon Age didn't sell, like, that's not to say that Dragon Age sold well. It didn't sell well at all. But it sold well enough to keep them afloat. And if it hadn't done any of that, I don't think BioWare would be around anymore. I think they'd be gone. Now, they fuck up this next Mass Effect, and it doesn't sell, then BioWare is done. Period. That's the end of them. The Game Award for most anticipated? Take a look real quick. Nah. Not with Grand Theft Auto 6 on this list. Absolutely not. GTA 6 is going to win that spot for sure. Like, I've watched plenty of other awards show this year that talked about most anticipated game, and it was pitted up against Ghost of Yotei and Death Stranding 2, and GTA wins every time. Like, people tend to underestimate just how big Grand Theft Auto is as a franchise and how many how many fans it has. Like, you pit that game up against anybody else, it's GTA every time. Every single time. Not even a question. Not fan, that's right, friends. Look at all my friends. See, Fancy gets it. All right, but enough with the Game Awards stuff. Let's get on to the next topic we got here. So let me see if I can do this tab business and hopefully it works. What is it? That ain't it. That's not it. What is it? This? Hey, that's not it. We talked about that. That's not it. We talked about that. Oh, speaking of websites, I got upset about the fact that Black Myth Wukong made it on the list. There you go, folks. You want to talk about websites that are upset about the fact that it made it on the Game of the Year list? Here you go. Like, oh, Black Myth Wukong is one of the lowest rated Game of the Year nominees in any Game Awards category. It's like, fuck off. Fuck off. Somehow, Geo, at least they're still somehow around. How, I have no idea. But okay, so let's talk about this Sony Kadokawa situation. Kadokawa had come forward talking about, or made public, that Sony had issued them a letter of intent to buy the company. Now, from my understanding at least, is that Kadokawa was kind of in the crosshairs of what I used to think was two corporations looking to buy it. But looking at recent news that came out maybe about a day or two ago, it might be more than that. And this rabbit hole goes deeper than what was initially published publicly. But anyways, so they're looking for this to happen, and Sony issued them a letter of intent to buy the company. Now, as it stands currently, I believe it is... Yeah, so Kadokawa currently owns a strong lion's share of the anime and manga industry, especially in Japan. But they also own a significant portion of From Software, which, with that knowledge in mind, you kind of understand why Sony might be interested in purchasing it. But the question is Sony really that interested in purchasing it? But I'll get into the aspects of that part of things later on. So, if this does happen, and Sony does buy Kadokawa, what happens? Like, who does this benefit? Well, mostly Sony, because it allows them to expand their portfolio of their anime and manga purchases. Let's not forget the fact that Sony purchased Crunchyroll and Funimation last year, which Funimation is now defunct, but Crunchyroll is still around. So they already own a significant portion of anime and manga publishing, especially over here in the West. If they were to buy Kadokawa, then they would own a significant portion of that over there in the West as well, which would effectively turn Sony into a monopoly in regards to the anime and manga industry, which at the end of the day is bad for us, the consumer. I'll get into negatives later. This kind of works for us, the consumer, to some extent, because if they were to get From Software, that opens up the possibility of games like a Bloodborne sequel, a Sekiro sequel, that people have been asking for years. And for the better part of a decade in Bloodborne's case. But there may be more to that story as well, which I'll get into a bit later. So who does this hurt? And this is more of a, I guess you could say, more of a theoretical negative at the end of the day, or set of negatives at the end of the day. Like I said, this would make Sony a monopoly in the manga and anime industry, considering how much they already own of that industry as it is. Now, why is that a problem? Well, Sony has a long and colored history when it comes to censorship. And they will strong arm people into doing so should they not comply. And the last thing you want is for publishers, writers, artists, whoever it might be, to have to muzzle themselves in the stories they want to tell to appeal to Sony's standards. And the way Sony has been as of late, and the amount of Western influence that has taken over the company, the last thing you'd want is for someone like that to have that much control over your entertainment. Especially when the competition starts dwindling because they own so much of it. Now, I mentioned how there is a bit more to this story than once perceived. And let's see, do I want to talk about this part of it? Should I talk about? Hold on, give me a sec. Give me a sec. I'll talk about one specific aspect of this whole story. Just give me a moment here. Let's see, which one do I want to talk about first? I guess we could talk about. Okay, yeah, we'll talk about this particular portion of it, and then I'll go into the other side of this whole thing as well. And the other side might be again, like everything going forward is probably mostly rumor. But I imagine a lot of these rumors are grounded in some form of truth. So just take everything you hear with a grain of salt, but keep it in mind. So we'll talk about this first rumor in regards to this subject, which is that Kadokawa may have approached Sony themselves to block a hostile takeover from Kakao. So there's more to the story than meets the eye. And the potential for Kadokawa to reach out to Sony to stop this whole thing from happening in the first place. But the question is, how did this whole thing come to a hostile takeover to begin with? And why are they at risk of being taken over by Kakao? Well, first of all, Kakao doesn't have a particularly great reputation. And they already own a significant portion of Japan Industries as it is. As it says here that I've highlighted, Kakao does not have a good reputation in spite of its financial success. We're talking about a company whose founder was embroiled in a gambling scandal when it first launched. This year, Kakao is embroiled in a stock manipulation scandal over the successful hostile takeover of K-pop and entertainment company SM Entertainment. So, the last thing you would want is a company like that to take over your company and you being powerless to stop them. But there's more to this, because there was a thread on Reddit talking about this particular subject as well, and it points to a lot of important pieces of information that people aren't quite pointing out and are kind of missing in this entire situation to begin with. So this comes from, I guess it's from Shinobi 602 on Reddit that talks about this. He says, typically the two parties agree to share price for a deal. Sony's not going to end up paying whatever Kadokawa's valuation rises to. What I meant was, now if Kakao wanted to do a takeover, they'd have to cough up even more cash. So linking it intentionally could make sense. If you feel like you've been reading too many stories, that's an editorial thing. Anyways, highlighted part down here. But here we'll share our insight in this Sony Kadokawa situation. It's something that you may not have wanted to read. This is the important part. Japan recently passed a new law that enables and no longer blocks hostile takeovers of Japanese companies. The law lays out guidelines for their satisfaction, but because these new rules, Japanese companies like 7-Eleven owner 7 and iHoldings are now vulnerable to being taken over by foreign owners. Yes, that means beloved Japanese game companies like Nintendo, Sega, and Square Enix are now vulnerable to hostile takeovers too, if someone had enough hubris and money to try. So it makes sense that Kadokawa would be desperate enough to pitch a monopoly with Sony to avoid a hostile takeover. Based on what Shinobi said, it's possible that Kadokawa doesn't really want to push through with the Sony deal. The move to disclose may be part of the company's succession, like chess moves, to hopefully get out of this with their independence, and all investments from both Sony and Kakao intact. So basically, they're trying to make this whole thing public to begin with, to try to deter them, either company from buying or taking over Kadokawa as a whole. And I'm not surprised that Kadokawa would more than likely not want this to happen. And it would be a bad move for someone like From Software as well, because that you could see Sony owning them kind of removing a lot of that their ability to create different IPs. And even more so when I talk about the information that I have later, the last thing you would want out of From Software is to constantly be cranking out Sekiro and Bloodborne sequels year in and year out. But that would be a very real possibility. If Sony ended up buying Kadokawa and owning From Software. Like right now, I believe Sony already owns a small portion of From Software. Go to my notes here and find out how much that is real quick. From what I was able to find on the internet about how much they own From Software. And that's split between 3 different companies, by the way. I believe Kadokawa is the majority owner of From Software with 70% of the shares, where Sony and Tencent are owning the rest. I think Sony owns about either I think Sony owns either 16 or 14%. With Tencent owning roughly 16 or 14% of well. I think it's like 16 and 14 split between Sony and Tencent. So Kadokawa owns the most, and then Sony and Tencent owns the other part of that in From Software. But if they were to buy Kadokawa, then they would be the majority owner of From Software. And that'd be even worse considering that you know how Sony is about exclusives, and you can imagine that most of their games will be locked to the PlayStation and then eventually ported to PC at some point, but then obviously Xbox fans will be asked out. So it is a question of the lesser of two evils, and they're hoping that neither one of them gets their hands on it. But I think the important bit about this is that law change that happened in Japan that allows hostile takeovers from foreign entities. So this could be the start of something far darker going into the future of Japan as a whole when it comes to their businesses. Now, obviously, no one's going to have enough money to sit there and drop down on owning Nintendo. But Sega and Square Enix, I could see someone trying to make that happen. I would say you're almost watching. You would damn near be effectively watching the effective culture of Japan being whittled away right in front of you. Effectively, everything you enjoy about Japan being erased, so to speak. And all it took was one law change to make that happen. So we'll see what happens. Either way, it's a lose-lose situation regardless of who ends up owning Kadokawa. Whether it's Kakao or Sony, it's not a good look for either side, no matter who ends up buying it. They are trying to lean more towards Sony, being the lesser of the two evils, but even then, you can't really trust Sony in that aspect either. So at the end of the day, nobody wins. Unless they're able to maintain their independence, nobody wins. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you fall on, no one wins. But there was some other news that came out this week that kind of goes into why Sony could potentially be interested in buying Kadokawa to begin with. And I did talk a little bit about this, like things like Bloodborne and Sekiro, for example. Any happy news? Depends on how you look at it. We'll put it that way. Depends on how you look at it. Let me see if I can get to the news here. Hold on. Which one is it? It depends on how you look at it. Here we go. So, what's the title of this one? Oh, yeah. So, there's potential about why Sony would want Kadokawa to begin with. And this comes from a Sony insider who reached out to a YouTuber and talked about this stuff. And I believe they reached out to, what's his name? YouTuber Endymion again. And the important bits about this are the highlighted sections here that I have here. So, in his video, he says, "From what I'm told by my source, the reason why Sony Japan wants to own Kadokawa and From Software is because they are extremely frustrated by the constant underperformances of their Western-led projects. We're talking things like God of War, The Last of Us, and of course, Concord, being a thorn in their side right now and how that all went down. Sony Japan is very angry that what used to be a promising Western push by their teams over in Sony America, they're no longer making the big hits that they were accustomed to having before. As I'm told by Kadokawa entering PlayStation's brand and in turn From Software is seen as a massive opportunity in Sony Japan's eyes to vastly strengthen and rebuild their PlayStation brand into what they deem as important and what PlayStation should stand for as a platform in the future. So they see things like Elden Ring's success, the constant love for properties like Dark Souls and Sekiro to be something that should be intrinsically tied to what Sony Japan wants to continue and foster in the future. So the reason why Sony would be interested in buying Kadokawa to begin with and From Software is because Sony is effectively trying to rebuild their Japanese presence. And they want to once again be known as a Japanese company that cranks out, the the hits that Sony Japan used to crank out before. He says, "Wait, is this Endymion from Sailor Moon?" I don't think so. I've seen him. And from what I've seen, he does not wear a tuxedo. I'm sorry. Listen, I hate to disappoint. I have not seen him in a tuxedo. He does not wear a mask. He doesn't have a top hat. Or he's never worn one at least. So, if you're looking for that, I got none of a disappointment for you. I had to break it to you. So, The question is, why would Sony be interested in rebuilding its Japanese presence? Well, right before this generation of consoles kicked off, if you recall, Sony was kind of in the process of effectively jumping shark from Japan as a whole. They had shut down Japan Studio, which was known for releasing games like Gravity Rush, everyone's favorite game, Knack and Knack 2, but they also had a significant hand in everyone's favorite From Software game, Bloodborne. That was a joint effort by From Software and Japan Studio. So when they shut down Japan Studio before the beginning of this generation, they had made it very clear that Bloodborne 2 just wasn't going to happen. Not like that. So all hopes went out the window with that. But also when that happened, there was a lot of articles that came out about the effectively Sony kind of downsizing its presence in Japan, and that Japanese developers were kind of upset by this. And they had come out and said effectively that Sony was abandoning Japan. And that's not from me. That's from their mouths. And that was at the beginning of the generation before the PS5 came out. But I would argue that this could be traced back even further before that. Trace it all the way back to the launch of the PlayStation 3, a console that was developed, architected, engineered entirely by Japan and Japanese staff. But of course, one of the big issues that happened when that console launched was that it was the most expensive console on the market. And unfortunately, that kind of hurt PlayStation 3 in terms of sales. The console just was not jumping off the shelves in the beginning because it was just too expensive. On top of the fact that when it launched, it had a lot of multi-platform games. And if anybody remembers the olden days of the early PS3 cycle, many of those multi-platform games ran like absolute garbage on the PS3 compared to the 360. Even though the PS3 was the more powerful console between the two, the ports ran like absolute garbage. And one of the reasons for that was because of a little thing called the cell processor. And Sony bet a lot on the cell processor. They bet so much that they were talking about how they wanted that thing in refrigerators, they wanted it in washing machines, they wanted it in computers. There was a very hard push for the cell processor back then. The thing about the cell processor, though, is that for those who weren't aware of it and how it was designed, they couldn't wrap their heads around it. They couldn't wrap their heads around the architecture, anything. And for a good long while there, for the first year or so of the PlayStation 3's launch, that plagued the console. If a game wasn't made from the ground up on PlayStation first, that was a wrap. If anyone remembers when Sega released and Platinum Games released the first Bayonetta, which was multi-platform, it came out on the 360 and PS3. The PS3 version of Bayonetta was garbage. In terms of performance, it was full of bugs. The whole thing was a mess. It was so much of a mess that Sega had to hire engineers from Sony specifically to come in and fix what Platinum could not to get the game up to snuff and on par with the 360 version. That's how bad it was, because no one could wrap their heads around the cell processor. As the years went on and people started getting a better understanding of how it worked, because a lot of the studios I'm working on them were first-party studios like Naughty Dog and Sucker Punch and so on, those games were fine because they had an idea of how it worked, and Sony was more than welcome to accommodate their studios to make sure that they got their games out in a presentable state. But that wasn't until way later in the life cycle of the console when that change finally started happening. We're talking about games like, Uncharted 3 and Killzone 3 and God of War 3 and all that stuff was right around the end of that cycle. And that's when people really started getting their heads around the cell processor. But by then, it was kind of too late because the 360 had already sold so much. It was kind of the console to put games on because it had outsold the PlayStation at the time. Lo and behold, that by the time the PlayStation 4 was coming around, everybody noticed a sudden change. The console was no longer being presented at a Japanese expo, it was being presented at an American one. Introduced by, who was it, Andrew House at the time? Before Sean Layden? And also introduced by one Mark Cerny. who I can't stand watching in videos 90% of the time because I get the feeling that he's going to pull off somebody off screen, possibly a hostage, and slit their throat on screen because of the way he talks. But that's besides the point. At that point, it became very clear that Sony was making a very significant push into the American market. Because the PlayStation 4 was no longer designed in Japan. It was designed in America. Designed, engineered, architected, all of it. Designed in America. Heralded and held up by one Mark Cerny. Now, this was a good thing overall because that meant that a lot of the hurdles that people had or developers had with the PlayStation 3, they no longer had to worry about the PlayStation 4 because it was designed more similarly to a PC than whatever the PS3 was. And it made development for that console much easier, which worked out at the end of the day. But since then, you started seeing the change in that because, again, they pushed harder in that due to the success of games like The Last of Us. And Japan was no longer cranking out the successes that they were hoping they could pull off. So that's when they started up Sony America. They pushed everything in that direction. And that's where things kind of continued a while because they were seeing a boom in that aspect. Like a lot of the Western-made games on PlayStation 4 were doing so well in about the first few years that it came out, up until the end of the PlayStation 4's life cycle, roughly around the end of 2019. Games had already come out like, the new God of War and 2018 and Horizon Zero Dawn and Ghost of Tsushima, which is a game about Japan made in the West. They saw that success. But then things started to shift right around 2020. Right around when a significant event happened in 2020, which I won't get into, but if you take a minute to think critically about what happened back then, you'll know what I'm talking about. And right when that shift happened, there was also a shift in entertainment, especially in video games. And some would say it was at that moment where everything started to take a downturn. And if you've been following a lot of the news about some of the games that have been announced as of late, you could follow the money all the way back to what happened in 2020. Games like Assassin's Creed Shadows. But people have been slowly waking up to the whole aspect of what's been going on lately, and average everyday people who usually wouldn't care about shit like this have also been pushing back against it. So you've seen a significant decrease in sales. And considering that Sony's not in a great state right now, especially at the release of a game like Concord, for example, and the $400 million sink that was in Sony's pockets, which I imagine eventually became a tax write-off, so I think it saved some money from that shit. I could see why Sony Japan would be upset. There was an article that came out a while back. See if I can find it. Just to really drive my point home about Sony being upset, and perhaps even leading credence to the the claims the insider made about Sony Japan being upset about the West's success. This came from PlayStation CFO. I don't want to pull it from this because that's a forum. Where is this at? Here we go. So yeah, this happened back in September, where Sony's CFO, Hiroki Totoki, talked about how they don't have enough original IP. I'll put this on screen right now so you guys can see it. Hold on. So yeah, he said, like, whether it's for games, film, or anime, we don't have that much IP that we foster from the beginning. We're lacking the early phase of IP, and that's an issue for us. And he's right. They don't really have a lot of original IP or IP that they foster from the beginning, because a lot of the franchises they had from the beginning, they either shuttered, moved on from, so on and so forth. Look at companies like a Nintendo, for example. Nintendo has IP that they fathered and fostered since, even before I was born. We're talking 30 plus years, and they're still going strong. Back in the mid 90s and early 2000s, Sony had tons of IP that people loved. You look at PlayStation now, what do they have? They used to have From Software games. When people thought about Dark Souls, they thought Sony. They don't have that anymore. They tried to make Spider-Man a thing, and they almost had it until they fumbled the bag on Spider-Man 2. They tried to make Ghost of Tsushima a thing. And now with Ghost of Yotei, they're clearly showing that they don't want to have a standout character for their PlayStation or their company. Like, another reason why Sony Japan is so upset is because they also wanted to make Jin Sakai a PlayStation character. And they were hoping that when Sucker Punch had revealed the next game they're working on, that it would be a continuation of that story, or at least that character. There was potential there for them to make him a PlayStation character, and they fumbled the bag on that. I guarantee you, when that Amazon show, what is it called, Secret Level, when that comes out, you're not going to see their new character up there. It's going to be Jin, guaranteed, because they had believed at one point that Jin was going to be the character for Ghost of Tsushima going on. That was going to be the franchise moving forward. Like I said, I haven't played too. How'd they fumble it? They fumbled it in terms of story. Spider-Man 2 is a mess in terms of story. I kind of talked about that in the past. This is one and Miles were good shit. One was good. Miles was okay in terms of story. Like, in terms of gameplay, like, Insomniac always has it pretty much locked down in terms of, like, mechanics and smoothness of gameplay. They always have that part nailed no matter what. But in terms of story, Miles Morales was kind of an indication of where they were going and how bad things could get. And then Spider-Man 2 was like the apex of just how bad it could get. So while a lot of this stuff is effectively rumor in terms of what Sony might be looking for and what's going on behind the scenes, there's a lot of dots that could be connected as to why this is leaning more likely to be true than not. Even with connections to this whole Kadokawa situation going on, and why that would technically work in their favor if they did buy Kadokawa and From Software, when trying to bolster up their Japanese presence, which the Japanese themselves have effectively said that Sony's kind of abandoned us towards the end of last generation. They were chasing the West while the West was chasing identity politics. And now that people are pushing back on that, they're kind of lost. So we'll see what this means for the future. But I can guarantee you this much. It's not going to end well for us, the gamers, at the end of the day. Whether they buy Kadokawa or not, again, it's a lose-lose for us. Whether you be on the video game side of things, or the anime manga side of things, or all of the above, no matter whoever ends up buying Kadokawa in this situation, we all lose. So the future ain't looking too great, at least in that regard. Hopefully all this is hopeful. I will be happy to be wrong about all of this. I'm hoping I'm wrong about all of this. But it ain't looking bright. Gio says, I'll buy them. Don't worry, I'll buy them. I shall own them. I shall buy the Kadokawa and save the anime and video games. But there's still a lot more to this, unfortunately, because I'm already at the end of time here for my podcast for this episode. But I got so much. Trying to avoid flipping through my pages so you guys can hear it, but I have a lot of notes here talking about this shit, and I could go on for another hour. But that would be a nightmare to edit. It was already a nightmare for last episode to edit when that one was like an hour and a half. I just extend it. For future me who has to edit it, he will not be happy about that. So trying to avoid all that nonsense. And also for the part where I kind of forgot to add the chapter markers for the archive. Of course I did, because I'm an idiot. But oh well. That'll be my punishment for not paying attention to that and doing that properly, I guess. But all right, anyways, I believe that is all I have for today's episode. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that, and hopefully you guys learned some more about this nonsense and drama that's been going on in the industry and even in the anime industry as well. And what that means for the future in regards to our enjoyment of entertainment and anybody else's. The last thing we need when it comes to entertainment as a whole is a monopoly. Especially if that monopoly is full of people that have a particular agenda, no matter which side of the aisle it is, left or right. The last thing you need is a specific company owning all of that and having all the jurisdiction to dictate where that goes. Especially Sony when they can't even seem to get themselves together. With studios that have seen many layoffs and shutdowns, including Firewalk, Sony doesn't know what it is, and it's still trying to find that. If any of these rumors are anything to be an indication of, Sony is still trying to figure out who they are again. It feels like there's a great reset going on behind the scenes, but whether or not that works out for us remains to be seen. So just be aware of that moving on into the future. But anyways, that's all I got for now, folks. Thank you all for watching. For those of you that are watching the archive version of this, hopefully you enjoyed the show as well. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Also, yeah, I'll try to get back to recording these on YouTube as well to do dual streams. I just got to make sure my internet can actually withstand that again, because it's been kind of a nightmare when it comes to that kind of stuff. But I'll try to get back to that as soon as possible so you guys can watch it live on YouTube as well. But yeah, I guess, again, a lot of the stuff at the end here is kind of basically based on my opinion, and I reserve the right to be wrong about all this stuff. Take everything I'm saying here, including the rumors, with a grain of salt. Could be wrong about all of this. In fact, I'm hoping that I am, because it's all bad news if I'm not. Until next time, I'll be back on. I'll probably end up just doing these on Saturdays. It just seems like Saturdays might be the proper time to start making these podcasts happen. So perhaps I'll do these on Saturdays live and then post the archive versions up on either Sunday or Monday the following week, and we'll go from there. But anyways, like I said, I'm still figuring this whole thing out. We're still early on in this whole podcasting thing. And like I said, I'll probably try to have guests on in the future to talk about these topics as well. And yeah, so we'll see how that goes. You all have a wonderful day or night, depending where you are in the world. You all stay classy, stay sharp. Don't do anything that I wouldn't do, and I will catch you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Love you all. Thanks for watching. I'm out of here. Deuces. And fade to black.